If you're new to realistic watercolor painting, specifically painting animals, this lesson is for you. If you have more experience and you're here, I'm glad you're here. We'll talk about materials, how to set up your space, simple materials, and then we'll move into some simple exercises so you can get to know your brush, get to know the paints. I'm starting from the very beginning. Now let's move into the materials you'll need just to get started. We're going to keep it simple. I'll show you my favorite materials, but every artist has their favorite materials, their favorite setup. I encourage you to do what works best for you. We'll talk about finding your space to paint, suggestions for setting up your paints and your water and your brushes. By the end of this, you'll have everything you need to prepare for your first painting exercise. So we need just a few supplies, something to put the paint on and mix the paint. You'll need watercolor paints, round brushes, we'll talk about this in a moment, watercolor paper or some kind of paper, a container for water, a towel, paper towels for cleanup, and if you don't have these specific materials, use what you have on hand as you experiment. To put the paint, you need something to put the paint on. It might be a palette like this. This is my favorite palette. It might be a plate. Anything that the color will not soak into. I use this hinged plastic palette. In our school, we use Winsor & Newton professional watercolor paints. If you're new to this and if you don't want to spend as much money, I should say, you could use Winsor & Newton Cotman. They're less expensive. They're student grade paints, very good quality, or use any kind of watercolor paint that you have on hand. Should you use tubes? Should you use pans? Use what works for you. I like to use tubes. They contain a smooth paste of paint. It's like toothpaste, and you squeeze just a little bit onto your palette and then you add water. The small tubes are fine. It's interesting how a little tube of paint like this really lasts a long time. Like it could last you weeks to months because you just use a little bit of paint. Pans contain dry, solid paint, and you add water to wake up the color. Tubes or pans, do what works best for you. We use a pointed round brush in our lessons. It has a narrow pointed tip so you can create details and you can create fur and use the side of the brush to lay in larger areas of color. In these lessons, you'll see 3 brushes. Use any brush that you have on hand. You don't have to use 3, just use 1. Use what you have. I'll use an old, cheap brush for mixing color, a small brush for details, and a medium-sized brush to fill larger shapes. I have 2 favorite small brushes I'll share with you. They're synthetic brushes. They're soft, but they're sturdy enough that they'll keep a fine point and you can create details and fur. This one is called a Michael Klein pointed round brush number 2. It's from Rosemary and Company in England. The brush head, let's just check this. It looks like this. And the brush head is pretty small. It's about a little less than ½ inch. And that's my favorite brush for creating details and thin lines. So you'll see this used in a lot of more recent tutorials. Another brush that I like to use is this Raphael Golden Synthetic Pointed Round Brush. It's a size 0. It's about the same size as the one I just showed you, and you can purchase this one in the United States. I also like to use a medium-sized brush for filling in larger areas. And in this lesson, I'll use a Princeton Velvetouch long round number 6. The brush head is about 3/4 inch. So here's the comparison between brushes. This is the small brush you'll see, and then the medium-sized brush. In our school, we also use larger brushes for creating backgrounds and really large areas, but really all you need is one of these brushes. Either one will work fine. And then I also use an inexpensive and old brush for mixing colors on the palette, and I save my good brushes for painting. If you only have one brush, just use that brush. That's fine. As far as watercolor paper, if you're just starting out, use any paper that you have on hand. Even if it's not watercolor paper, just get a piece of paper and start, because we're working on techniques. It doesn't have to be pretty yet. Or you could purchase inexpensive watercolor paper. The results might not look quite the same as what you see in this lesson, but that's okay. In these lessons, we'll use Osh 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. Now, here's what that means. Osh is the brand name. 140 pounds is the weight of the paper. Now, the piece of paper doesn't weigh 140 pounds, but that's how they describe the weight of the paper. The color is natural white. Cold pressed means that the texture is slightly rough, and you could buy a large piece of the paper and then cut it down to whatever size you like. I often do that. Or you could use a block, a watercolor block, which is sheets of paper stacked together and they're glued along the edges. This is what a block looks like. Now, this is hot pressed paper. The cold pressed is green. The hot pressed is pink. The hot pressed is very smooth, but this is what it looks like. So right around the edge, all these sheets there are how many sheets in here? There are 20 sheets in this block, and they're glued together just along the side so you can create your painting. And then when you're finished, you can stick like a knife in here and remove the paper from the block, and then you'll have another piece of paper to work with. So this just helps to keep the paper flat. But you want the green one, not the pink one. Usually, I purchase these large pieces of watercolor paper, and then I cut them down to size. So today, I'm using small pieces like this to create our little practice. So I encourage you to use whatever size you wish, whatever works best for you. The other things you might need, the other things you do need, container for water. I like to use a Tupperware container. You'll need a towel or paper towels. And I'm right-handed, so this is what my setup looks like. It's set up on my right. I encourage you to just find a small area. That's all you need. A table and a chair, natural light, or if you paint at night, a natural light bulb. So is there a small space where you can set up and keep your supplies? Somewhere you can just lay everything out and leave it there? And maybe if you have pets or there's just no space, place all of your supplies in a container, because there's just a few things that you need, and just find a space, take everything out, set it up, paint, and then put it away when you're done. My first space was in a corner of the living room, just a small table near a window. I used that for about a year, and then I moved into an upstairs bedroom. And let's move into getting to know your brushes and your colors. So a little bit of techniques practice. So we've got a simple practice exercise for you. By the end of the lesson, you'll have some techniques to practice, and the goal is for you to simply become acquainted with your brush and the colors. We'll talk about getting started, preparing your colors, two terms that are part of our watercolor language, value and consistency. Simple brush techniques, picking up color, creating lines, filling in shapes, and practice exercises. And we'll talk about some troubleshooting too. And again, I know I keep saying this. Every artist has their favorite materials, their favorite setup, their favorite techniques. So take what you like and use it. If there's something you don't like, that's fine. The materials we'll be using, use your favorite brush, any watercolors that you have on hand, something to place the paint on, a tub of water, towel, some kind of paper. If you don't have watercolor paper, it's okay. Use any kind of paper, even if it wrinkles, because you're just practicing techniques here. Getting ready. Let's talk about getting ready to paint. So this is my setup, and these are the brushes I'll be using in this lesson. We've got an old brush for mixing colors, and a small brush and a medium-sized brush. This is the medium-sized brush. It's about a 1/2 inch. And then this is the Michael Klein I talked about. This is the palette that I use. It's about 10.5 inches long, easy to store. You can open it and close it. And I allow the paint to dry. Use your favorite palette. Any surface that repels water. It can even be a paper plate. And here's the water in a Tupperware container. You could use a glass, whatever you prefer. Paper towel. I like to use paper towels. You could use a regular cloth towel. I hold the towel in my left hand and the brush in my right hand because I'm right-handed. This is a piece of Osh 140-pound cold-pressed paper. Now, one side is a little more textured and the other side is smoother. I like to use the side that is less textured, but that's personal preference. I place one color in each well of this palette, but this is ultramarine blue, so I squeeze a little bit into the well. It looks like toothpaste. And this is burnt umber. So whenever I begin to run out of paint, I just add a little bit more. And it's okay if there's a little bit of paint left in there from before. Now this is my mixing brush, and to wake it up, rinse it in water. Wipe it on the towel, and you can kind of smooth the color if you'd like. Then rinse the brush again. I'll be saying this a lot. Rinse the brush, wipe it on the towel. Here's a paper plate. If you don't have a palette, just a little bit of color. You don't need much. It lasts a long time. You can clean your palette with a damp paper towel. But I often leave my watercolors on the palette. I allow them to dry. And then I just wake them up with water when I'm ready the next day. So it's okay if the color dries on the palette. Every morning, the first thing I do is I wake up the color with drops of water. This is the tube from a pen. So I pick up just a tiny bit of water and place a drop in the colors I'm going to use and allow the water to soak in. Now, when you're first getting started for the day, you'll want to wake up your brush, dip it in water, wipe it on the towel, and I'm turning the brush to create a pointed tip. I use my old brush to bring the color to the palette. And the color is going to be thick at first, and we're going to add water to thin it out. Now let's show you how it looks if you're using a paper plate. You can bring some water to the palette, then pull a little bit of color into the water, and the water will thin out the color. Now, when you're finished with your brush, you always want to remember to rinse it, wipe it on the towel so it's clean, and we are ready to paint. Value and consistency. This is part of our watercolor language. Value is how dark or light a color appears. The terms you hear most often. Light value means the color is going to look pale. Midtone value, a little darker. Dark value is darker yet. So light value, midtone value is like in between dark and light, and then dark values. The other word that you hear a lot is consistency. Consistency is the thickness of the paint. It's based on the amount of water that we add to the color. The terms you'll hear most often are the consistency of tea to water. And if you look on the right image, it's that lower part of the color that is very clear. The consistency of milk. There's a little less water with the consistency of milk, and the consistency of thin cream, that's even thicker. Consistency and value are related. So the consistency of water to tea will create a light value, as in the first column. The consistency of milk, it's still pretty thin on the palette. It will create a midtone value, the second column. And the consistency of cream will create a dark value. And now, let's do a bit of practicing. It's helpful to anchor the back of the hand to the table, and I like to hold my brush kind of like a pencil. Okay, this is what we're doing. This is kind of what you're going to create. And let's start by creating a thin consistency. I'm bringing in clean water and then pull a little bit of this. This is burnt umber. Prepare your brush so it's clean and just slightly damp. Turn the brush to fill it with color. I'm using the smoother side of the paper. Feel free to use either side and see which one you like better. And I'll use the side of the brush to create a small square. This is the consistency of tea. It's a light value. Now you want to rinse your brush, wipe it on the towel, get in the habit of doing that. Now I'm going to add just a little bit of water to this color, so it looks a little darker. This is called the consistency of milk, and that's going to create a slightly darker value. Rinse that brush, wipe it on the towel, make sure it's completely clean. And I'm adding the tiniest bit of water to the color up here. I call this, it looks like thin cream. And that's going to create a darker value yet. Rinse the brush, wipe it on the towel till it's clean. Now you can use the medium-sized brush to do this too. So really, any brush that you have on hand. We're going to bring some clean water to the palette. This is ultramarine blue. I'm adding water to create something that looks like water to tea. Use the side of the brush to create a square, and that is really pale, isn't it? That's the consistency, I would say, of blue water. Rinse the brush and wipe it on the towel. And let's add just a tiny bit of water. It's going to look a little darker on the palette. It's going to look like milk, blue milk. Turn the brush, fill it with color. Use the side of the brush to create a square of color. And it's looking a little darker. That's a mid-tone value, consistency of milk. Every time you want to rinse your brush and wipe it on the towel. Now we're adding just a touch of water. Pick up something that looks like thin cream. And do you see how dark it is? I'm using the side of the brush to create a square. And that creates a dark value. And I just rinse the brush. So here we've got the consistencies across the top and the values, light, mid-tone, and dark. Now you can do the same kind of thing if you're using a paper plate. Bring in some plain water and pull just a little bit of color into the water, thinning it out, consistency of red water to tea. You want to get rid of those drips, by the way. Use the side of the brush to create a square of color, and that is a lighter value. Now we're going to see if we can find something that contains a little less water. I'm aiming for something that looks like red milk. Now that's looking really dark. I probably could have added a little more water to the mix, but that's okay. Now I'm looking for something thicker, but not too thick. It's only thin cream. I'm having a little bit of trouble here. I ended up having some like goopy paint on my brush, so I just rinse the brush completely, wipe it on the towel, make sure it's clean. If this happens to you, just rinse it, and let's go back in again. I'm adding a tiny bit of water. I'm looking for something that looks like thin cream. This doesn't look much different from the other one, but that's okay. We're practicing, right? When you're finished with the brush, rinse it. Make sure it's nice and clean. Label the colors. Take notes. Here I'm just making a note to myself. And create as many squares of color as needed until you feel comfortable creating consistency and value. And take notes. Now this water it will become cloudy, so just change it when it becomes cloudy. I created just some little exercises. So the next thing you're going to do is practice filling small shapes with color, shapes like this. Circles and things. These are similar to shapes that we create in our paintings. Circles for eyes. You often see shapes like this within animals. So we're going to fill some circles with color. These are 1-inch circles. Burnt umber. I'm adding a little bit of water, creating the consistency of tea, something that looks like tea or thin milk, like 1% milk. So this is going to create a light value. And we're going to use the small brush. So I'm rinsing the brush in water. I want the brush to be not dripping wet, but just slightly damp. Turn the brush to fill it with color. It's helpful to anchor the back of the hand to the table and apply the color with the side of the brush to fill the shape. Now, the brush is probably going to run out of color. You'll probably have to pick up some more. Here's the key. Continue to add color to the edge of the brown before it dries, and that will help you to create a smooth application. Now I'm picking up. What would happen if you would just accidentally drip water into the color? You could try, while it's wet, see if you can smooth it out. This might work with smaller shapes. See, that's smoothing it out a little bit. Then allow it to dry. Now let's experiment with some French ultramarine blue. I'm adding water, creating something that looks like tea, blue tea to thin milk. Turn the brush to fill it with color. Get rid of that little drip there so it doesn't drip into the color. I like to use thin consistencies when filling shapes with color. Here we have a little fuzz. Turn the brush, fill it with color, and add the blue to the blue that's already in the circle. I hope that made sense. When the brush runs out of color, pick up some more and start with the edge of the previous blue. You can use the tip of the brush to create a nice clean edge. Then rinse the brush and wipe it on the towel. Now, you can use a different size brush. You don't have to use a tiny brush like that. Let's use this Alizarin. Add water, aiming for something that looks like red tea to milk. Now, with a larger brush, you don't need to completely fill that brush with color. And with practice, you'll get a feel for how much color to pick up. But the larger brush fills the circle more quickly, so that's kind of nice. You can turn the painting, use the tip of the brush along the edge and the side of the brush in the inner part. When you use thin consistencies, it's easier to fill shapes. So experiment with the amount of color on the brush and how wet the brush is. You can layer color to take it darker. You want to make sure that previous layer is completely dry, and I often use a hair dryer. I'm checking dryness with the back of my little finger, and I'll pick up the consistency of tea again. It's important that the previous layer is completely dry. Now this is looking pretty pale, that consistency of tea. But let's lay this in and let's pick up something like milk. Now, the color's still wet, and you can lay it in while it's wet. And that's creating a slightly darker value. So by layering, you apply a layer of color, allow it to dry completely, apply another layer of color, allow it to dry completely, and you can continue to layer color. You're just getting rid of those little bubbles, but you won't see them when it's dry. Now you can also practice with larger shapes. Here's a circle, and then I'm just adding this to it. This is a shape that's similar to what we see in painting animals. You might want to to try some different colors. This is yellow ochre. Initially, it's thick, and you rinse that brush, and we'll lay in a small puddle of clean water, pull a little bit of yellow ochre into it, creating something that looks like yellow tea to thin milk. And I'll use my small brush, make sure it's clean, slightly damp, turn the brush to fill it with color. I like to begin in the center of the shape and then kind of pull and guide the color where I'd like it to go. Make sure you're using the same consistency every time you pick up color. And when the brush runs out of color, pick up a bit more, same consistency. And pull and guide the color where you'd like it to go. Then rinse the brush, wipe it on the towel. Let's use a different brush, that medium-sized brush, and how about some blue? I'm adding water, creating something that looks like blue tea to very thin milk. It's helpful to begin in the center of the shape and then pull and guide the color where you'd like it to go. If you see puddles, you can pull the color and thin it out. The larger brush contains more color. And then if you would have a puddle right on the tip of the shape, clean the brush and dry it, and then you could just kind of lift it. Now, if you'd like to create a darker value, first, make sure it's completely dry. I check it with the back of the finger. And let's pick up the consistency of milk. So the previous layer is dry. Apply the color to the center first and then guide it where you'd like it to go. And I purposely went over the edge there when we'll show you how you can lift the color. Use the tip of the brush along the edge. Now rinse the brush and wipe it on the towel so there's no water on the brush or very little water. And then you can just keep pulling the color into the tip of the shape. Now let's lift some of this color. Well, let's lift this color where it went too far. I'm going to dry this first so I don't accidentally leak water into the color. And the brush is clean and slightly damp. And if you just go over this area that you want to remove and touch it with a paper towel, then rinse the brush again. The brush is slightly damp. And go over it again, gently. Touch it with a paper towel. You can remove a lot of that color. You could use a sturdier brush too. This is a synthetic. It's my old mixing brush. So if one brush doesn't work, try a different one if you have more than one brush. And you can lift that color. Here, lift a bit of this alizarin. The brush is just slightly damp. And there it is. Practice filling shapes with color. Use thin consistencies. Experiment with how wet the brush is. You want it to be just damp. How much color's on the brush. Be patient, learn from mistakes, take notes, and persevere. And next, let's look at how you can practice creating lines. And by the way, break this down into smaller steps, right? Maybe the first day, get your materials together, take as long as you need. Then the next day, practice creating shapes, or even take a day or two to do it, because you know when you take a break, your brain is still thinking about it. And coming back the next day, you're reinforcing. And once you're feeling good about creating shapes, then move into creating lines. So we're going to be creating something like this. Techniques for lines of various lengths and widths. I'll start with burnt umber. Use any color that you prefer. Consistency is tea to thin milk. Now you want your brush to be clean and barely damp. Just a bit of color on the tip of the brush. Anchor the back of the hand to the table. Use the tip of the brush to create short lines. Now, this is pale because we used a thin consistency. If you use more of the brush, the lines will be thicker. If you'd like to go a little darker, use something like milk. The tip of the brush is barely touching the paper. And you can create nice thin lines. If you use more of the brush, the lines will be thicker. Let's switch up the color. I find that the consistency of tea to milk works best. And the key is your brush needs to be clean and just barely damp. And you want to pick up just a little bit of color on the tip of the brush. Anchor the back of the hand to the table. Create a longer line. Now that's really pale, isn't it? You can hardly see it. That was a thin consistency. So let's rinse the brush. The brush is barely damp. Let's pick up something that looks like milk. Just a little bit of color. And you want to turn the brush so that you cover all sides of the brush. Anchor the back of the hand and you can create a longer line using the very tip of the brush. If you use more of the brush, it'll be a thicker line. Let's thin out the consistency just a little bit to something like thin milk. I'm using more of the brush. You see, it's not a nice clean line. It's got some little dibbles in it. Let's try the consistency of tea, see how that looks, using a little more of the brush. So a thinner consistency. Consistencies behave differently, and that's why we're practicing. Let's create some edges of shapes. Now you can find these shapes on the downloadable PDF on the lesson page. Often we create edges of shapes in our paintings. And a medium-sized brush works just as well. Just a bit of color on the tip of the brush is all that's needed. And the tip of the brush barely touches the paper. Now here I'm using a little more of the brush and the line is a little thicker. Practice using more of the brush or the tip of the brush. I'm adding just a little bit of water. You'll find that you'll need to add water to the color on the palette because it will dry. So we're using the tip of the brush, and I rinse the brush often. Experiment with an even thinner consistency. A tiny, tiny bit of color on the brush. And do you see how pale that is? Thinner consistency equals a lighter value. And you can go over it again if you wish with a slightly thicker consistency. Tip of the brush is barely touching the paper. My hand is anchored to the table. So there's more of the brush, right? A little more of the brush. And this is when I use the very tip of the brush. And let's have some fun with this shape. I'll go back to my smaller brush. If you run out of color, you can bring more color to the palette at any time. It will appear thick, but as you add water, you can thin out the consistency. So I'm aiming for something like milk. The brush is clean and barely damp. Anchor the back of the hand to the table to keep your hand steady. The tip of the brush is barely touching the paper. And you see how I'm turning the paper for an easy reach. Take your time. More of the brush creates a thicker line. And when your brush runs out of color, pick up a bit more. If the color doesn't want to come off the brush, give it a rinse, wipe it on the towel, and pick up more color because sometimes the color cakes on the brush. And you can move to any part of the line that you wish. Sometimes I like to start at one edge, then I go to the other edge and kind of meet in the middle. Take your time, rotate the paper to your comfort, and practice creating thin lines, thick lines, experiment with consistencies. And remember to rinse the brush, wipe it on the towel often. And now we'll just have a little bit of fun here. Maybe I want to create a little circle and then fill it with color. Tea to thin milk is the consistency. Pick up a bit more. Use your imagination. Experiment with thin lines and then fill shapes with color. Here's a nice thin shape. Let's create another little shape over here. Thin lines. Tip of the brush barely touching the paper. When the previous layer is dry, you can lay in another layer to go a little darker. But you want to make sure that the previous layer is dry. And every time I pick up color, it's just a bit of color on the tip of the brush. Here I'm creating some tiny hair-like or fur-like lines that are curving slightly. And when the brush runs out of color, pick up a bit more color. Experiment with different consistencies. Experiment with a brush that is more wet or more dry. Turn the paper for your comfort. This is how we create fur. If you would like to take that shape a little darker, make sure it's dry. Maybe you want to use something like milk or even thin cream, and this will create a slightly darker blue. Would you like to apply another thin layer? Use a gentle touch, and the previous layers should stay in place as long as they're dry. And let's apply a thin layer of blue, consistency of tea, over that shape, and you can still see the previous lines. Thin consistencies. Use the tip of the brush to create nice thin lines. Do you stretch your paper before you start a painting? When I'm creating small studies like this, smaller pieces of paper, this piece is about 5 inches. And if I'm not using a lot of water, I do not stretch the paper. But when creating a larger painting like this, I do stretch the paper. So basically, anything 5 by 7 inches or larger, I stretch the paper. And that means I soak the paper in water for 3 to 5 minutes. Okay, so I soaked this watercolor paper in water for 3 to 5 minutes. While it's wet, I stapled it. I just used standard staples. I stapled it to something called gator foam board. This is sturdy. It's like styrofoam, nice and sturdy so it won't bend. Sometimes when you use cheaper or thinner styrofoam, the wet paper causes the styrofoam to bend, but this is nice and sturdy. And then you allow it to dry completely. I allow it to dry overnight. Personally, 5 by 7 and larger, I stretch the paper. Smaller paintings that don't require a lot of water, I don't stretch the paper. Thank you for asking that, Lynn. That's great. So we're painting, we're practicing, we're filling a shape with color, consistency of tea to thin milk. And you're rinsing your brush, you're wiping it on the towel, you're doing everything right. And you want to add color where the brown ends. Hopefully you want to do this while the previous brown is still wet. Now, here's the issue. Sometimes you get interrupted. You walk away and the color dries. That previous color has dried and now I'm seeing a darker value. Here's one solution. This might work. Pick up that same consistency. Continue to fill the shape. This works for smaller shapes. Now I'm still seeing that darker value, but let's go over, or let's apply another layer of color to that color. And you see, you can smooth that previous layer of color. This especially works when you're using thin consistencies. And then you can lift color with your clean, slightly damp brush. Okay, let's look at another issue you might run into. Let's use ultramarine blue. Consistency of tea to thin milk. Let's fill the shape with blue. I'm using my slightly larger brush, so the color's going in more quickly because the brush holds more color. Let's just get this color in place. Oh no, I dripped water into the color. I've done this before. It's frustrating. There is a way to clean this up. Allow the color to dry completely. Like completely dry. Now, actually, that's kind of nice, isn't it? It's kind of a cool thing that I'm seeing, especially in the blue, but maybe when you're painting realistic animals, maybe you don't want to see that. So I'll start with the burnt umber. Consistency of tea to thin milk. Fill the brush with color, turn the brush to fill it. Often another thin layer will smooth that little blotch of color. So I'm filling the entire shape, and now I can't see where that little blotch is. Here you can use your slightly larger brush. Consistency, tea to thin milk. And if you just apply another layer of color, that will often smooth the previous layer. And we're just about there. I think I might need to pick up a little more color. Let's pick up a bit more. And while it's wet, let's lay some more in. And you see how it's smoothing the previous layer? So that works for very thin layers in the early part of a painting when you just have a couple layers in place. All right, let's get some more ultramarine blue in here. Now I'm going to load my brush with really thin color. And what I'm seeing here is puddling. You see that darker blue? I'm just getting blue puddles. But what you can do is thin and guide the color. Just kind of thin it out. Now, rinse your brush, wipe it on the towel. So now the brush is clean and barely damp, and just pull the color to the tip of the shape. And there you go. Use the tip of the brush to clean up the edge. Have fun practicing. Thin layers of color. A slightly to a barely damp brush is what we use. Get your materials in place, find a place to paint, and practice. Take your time. Maybe you just want to focus on one thing at a time. Make mistakes, learn from mistakes, take lots of breaks, and as you practice, your skills and your confidence will grow. And my goal is to share with you the techniques and the knowledge so that you can create your own paintings in your own unique style. You don't have to do exactly what I do, but take what works and use it and persevere, because you can do this. Let me know if I missed anything. For a membership, I'm looking at Nancy's question. For a membership, does that give access to all tutorials and reference picture too? Yes. Inside the membership, you get everything. Reference photo, drawing, materials, the entire painting, step-by-step video. Or sometimes we do smaller studies. We have downloadable reference charts. So thanks for asking that, Nancy. Well, everyone, that's it. I hope you found this lesson helpful and enjoyable. I sure enjoyed presenting it to you. I hope you have a great day. Thanks for watching. See ya.